sector is poised to lead on this. Without a strong and empowered nonprofit sector, complex social issues that we face, whether it's the opioid epidemic, gang violence, poverty, hunger, these issues would magnify significantly. It is the nonprofit sector that government often relies on to reach into the shadows and bring problems that are on the fringe into the light for solution building. And yet in this moment in time, it's the opposite. It's arguable that our federal government has brought extraordinary problems into the light. Problems of racial, economic, social bias and discrimination, institutional, structural racism, and more. And we have to come together and know how to respond to be able to impact change. And we have to change too. We have to reflect on who we are. The nonprofit sector has historically had an employee base that is overrepresented by women. The majority, approximately 74% of charitable nonprofits in the United States are led by women. Yet we know that nonprofit CEOs are typically paid 10% less than their male counterparts. When you widen the framework to include all nonprofit positions, the pay gap expands. Inequity in pay is really pay discrimination, and for women, discrimination begins very early in life. The inequity further expands if you consider ethnicity in the analysis, with Black and Latino women earning less than white women. While women make up 3/4 of the sector workforce, they comprise only 16% of CEOs of nonprofits and foundations with budgets over $50 million. That is us in this room and our colleagues who aren't. That is our field. This year, for all of us in health and human services, it has been a year unlike any other. We've had to respond to the constant assault on people's basic needs, whether it's access to food, refuge from international violence, access to medical services, or any of the basic needs that make up our ability to be part of a collective humanity, perhaps to feel human at all. As regulations roll back about environmental safety, trade, and so much more, our efforts as it relates to social justice are needed more than ever. They are a moral and existential imperative. During this last year, so many of you have shared the vicarious trauma with me that you are facing as executives leading organizations that often serve people most in need on Long Island in a time when social services have been relentlessly under attack. There is no more important work. And I see you, and I hear you, and I've heard you, and it's why I wanted to bring together a panel that could both share the experiences that they've had regarding bias, hate, and discrimination, and the way in which, in their sector, in their roles, be it civic, government, law enforcement, public education, or higher education, how they make a difference, what they can do, because we all need to be inspired. We all need to be inspired to remember what we can do and what we have to do. We can impact, and we can rise up from right where we are and demand and contribute to a world, to a Long Island that is just. And we can also do it better when we partner with leaders in the sectors that these distinguished panelists represent. But in order to do that, we have to remember where we come from. The legacy of our beloved Long Island is rooted in a history of geographic and racial segregation, one of the most vivid forms of oppression. We live in a region where, as much as we love our communities, we see NIMBYism, separation, and differing opportunities everywhere we turn. We are, in fact, the nation's first suburb, a place of such promise, but not for all families. America's first suburb, as Elaine Gross recently wrote in an essay for the Long Island Index, was built with all white policies, excluding blacks from home ownership through restrictive covenants. Robert Moses, for whom our beaches and highways are named, bulldozed homes and communities in order to make room for urban renewal, and actively discriminated in his regional planning. And despite increasing diversity on Long Island, segregation has persisted. People of color on Long Island are more likely to be part of the working poor, with 26% of Black and 34% of Hispanic Long Islanders living below 200% of the federal poverty line. And the implication of being born poor? Well, on Long Island, your zip code is a big contributor to your educational opportunities, your social mobility, and so much more. And poverty has a huge impact on developmental trajectory when access to nutritious food, safe housing, and resources are lacking. That is a critical part of our history here on Long Island. But it's not just our history that we have to look at. We have to look backwards, but we have to look at now too. where segregation persists, where swastikas have been painted on our schools, where some people are afraid to leave their homes. We are all moved by the uprising of teenagers who are standing against gun violence, and we really should be. But we have communities that have been plagued with gun violence all over the nation, and that hasn't raised our consciousness to affect solutions of change. We have an opioid epidemic right now, and I am so glad as a region that we are facing, addressing, and beginning to resource it. But we have communities that have been plagued with drug addiction for decades, and where have the resources been for them? I think frequently about the difference between living north of the traffic light on Washington Avenue versus south, Hempstead or Garden City, and the differing opportunities for children in those neighboring schools. It should never be that the child in Garden City whose home is next door to his neighbor, likely his friend, who is zoned for Hempstead, has radically different chances in life that begin to be shaped in pre-K. I think of our president's declaration a few weeks ago that the war on poverty is largely over, and quite honestly, I feel ill, because we have 197,004 households on Long Island that meet the woefully inadequate guidelines of living in poverty, federal guidelines that are no different for East Hampton, New York than for Flint, Michigan. These guidelines of $24,858 annually for a family of 4 is a woefully inadequate description of what poverty means here on Long Island. In fact, United Way put out a report recently that examined what income a family of 4 would need to earn on Long Island just to meet their basic needs, and found that a survival budget for a family of 4 is $80,940 in Nassau County, and 31% of folks live below that in Nassau County. And a survival budget in Suffolk is $90,324, and 39% of households live below that. And yet Long Island continues to be perceived as a place where poverty just doesn't exist, or a place where it's concentrated in only a few specific communities, and that is just not the case. We cannot be afraid of our history or our current state, and we have to face our truth if we are to see progress. And when we think of poverty and we think of struggle, we have to recognize the incredible demographic shifts that have taken place in our region. Since 2014, nearly 10,000 children have come to Long Island as unaccompanied children. This represents a very quick demographic shift that has required new planning, new thinking, new opportunities for this sector to work together and to work with school districts and other providers. These are children who have faced pre-migration, migration, and post-migration trauma, and they are our neighbors. They seek what every child seeks, a sense of safety, normalcy, an opportunity to realize their goals and their dreams. They are in so many ways stories of resiliency of human spirit. Their strength and perseverance far exceeds that to which most of us are exposed in our regular lives. And yet the federal anti-immigration sentiment, the policies that have the impact of requiring people to choose between family separation and food, this has had devastating consequences, particularly here on Long Island. The president has declared Long Island ground zero for targeting MS-13. Not the many gangs that have existed on Long Island for decades, just MS-13. And in doing so, and using language that dehumanizes unaccompanied alien children, is there anyone in this room who could use the word alien and child in the same sentence? This has created a climate that puts Latino children and families in tremendous peril. What this has meant in the health and human service sector is that over 1 million women have dropped off of WIC, the nutrition program for babies and moms, in the last year across the nation. Families are purposely foregoing benefits. So many of you have shared with me the drop-off rates in your programs that folks in need who are entitled to SNAP and Medicaid and other services are not getting because they are afraid of scrutiny and deportation and family separation. And in this region that is so siloed, where services are so hard to access without effective transportation or integration of services, we have emerging issues of hunger. We have American citizens, American-born children who are facing health crises because the basic nutrition they need is out of reach. Because while they are citizens, maybe grandma or someone else in the family isn't, and the fear of the family being broken up and torn apart, the choice is between being a family or feeding your family. This is unconscionable, and this is modern-day Long Island. I want to end with some hope, because I painted a pretty painful picture here. We see children mobilized, engaged, and inspired across the nation, and extraordinary young stewards of social justice here on Long Island. We are America's first suburb. We are poised to lead the nation on what it means to solve and address suburban poverty and all the challenges that come with it. To do so, we must honor and face our history, and we must be willing to have the difficult conversations, to recognize our own implicit bias, to look at what we've accepted for our neighbors. I sent some of my staff to a conference on advancing racial equity in Albany this week. It was sponsored by the New York State Council on Children and Families. And a research associate from the Kirwan Institute said the following: diversity asks, who's in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose perspective is under threat of being erased? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken seriously because they're not in the majority. Martin Luther King once said, wait has almost always meant never. Well, we can't wait any longer, and never is not something we can embrace. Now is the time for choosing our path forward as One Long Island.